everyone, it's Seji and welcome to another episode of A Book Chat with. I am here today with Greg Brooks, who is the official archivist of the band Queen. Hello Greg, how are you?
Hello there, Seji. I'm very well, thank you.
Thanks so much for coming on. So we're here today to talk about the second edition of Freddie Mercury, A Life in His Own Words, which is a collection of Freddie's quotes from the 2 decades he was active in the music industry. These quotes span a large spectrum of topics from fame, his influences and creative process, to more personal topics such as friendships and his views of himself. Greg, together with Simon Lupton, compiled and edited this lovely book. But before we dive into all of that, Greg, could you perhaps tell me a bit about yourself? What do you, as the archivist of Queen, do?
Okay, I do quite a lot actually. When I was first employed, which was 22 years ago, I was taken on as just purely an archivist to look after the audio and video tapes. And then things grew and grew. So now I work on box sets, and we conceive and compile box sets and DVDs and books, and I oversee exhibitions and all kinds of things really. It's that old thing about with my job, no 2 days are ever the same. It's very varied and exciting.
Oh, okay. So for example, what would you do like on a normal day working in the archive?
Well, that depends. At the moment, for example, the last few weeks we've been going into each and every audio tape, the original session recordings, and gathering all the track sheets together, the original paperwork that the engineers and producers and the band would have worked from, gathering all of those together and photographing them and logging them, so that when the engineers here have reason to be working on a song for any reason, they need to go back to the original information and notes and settings and technical information. So it's good for me to be able to say, well, for that song you're working on or that album, here are all the track sheets and all the information. So I've been doing that most recently, photographing tapes, just looking at the quality of the actual tape. Sometimes we do a sweep of everything to make sure that no mold has set in, or that the original tape stock is in good condition, things aren't coming off the spool or showing signs of deterioration, just general maintenance.
Okay, so you save a lot of people a lot of time, I presume.
That is a very good point. That's kind of a big part of the job, saving people a lot of time, ideally, yes, by directing them to certain specific things rather than having to trawl through. For example, I think we have 60 or 70 Night at the Opera multi-track tapes. So if they're looking for a particular song or a particular version of a song, it's nice to be able to say, well, you don't have to look at 55 of them. They're on this 5.
Oh, that's great. So this book originally came out back in 2006. So I was wondering, when and how did the idea to create it actually come up?
Well, it's a long time ago now, but I remember thinking that there was no definitive place to go and look at all the quotes that Freddie ever made or said, or transcriptions of interviews. If you wanted to find out about Freddie, you'd have to buy, I don't know, many books and listen to many interviews, be it audio or television. And from all of that stuff, you may be able to gather quite a bit, but it would take you forever. I know that because it used to take me forever when, as part of my job, anybody said, what quotes from Freddie do you have where he's talking about songwriting or relationships? I'd then spend 2 days collating everything. So I decided it'd be a good idea if we tried to gather everything that we knew of and offer it in one place. So it initially started as just an idea for a resource where you could go into a folder and find 300 quotes or something. And then I thought, well, actually, why don't we make a book out of it? I spoke to Simon and he thought it was a good idea. And then we spent a year compiling and editing.
That's lovely, because I was searching for interviews with Freddie, and it was actually quite hard, and then I came about this book and it was just perfect because it has like almost 200 pages that are just filled to the brim.
Yes, it's about, well, it's just over 70,000 words. Initially, the first pressing was, I think, something like 62,000. And yeah, I just thought, well, it's about time somebody did this for Freddie. I think if he were around today, still being asked the same questions over and over, he'd probably say something like, for goodness sake, can't we gather all my stuff together and give it to them so they don't keep asking me this stuff?
Yes, exactly.
Well, I just thought we thought it was definitely worthy, and Freddie talking about more or less anything is worth sitting down and reading, because he invariably delivered his comments in an unusual or interesting or flippant or poignant way. One way or the other, they're interesting and worth your time, you know?
Hmm. Yeah, definitely. I think he would have really appreciated having this book. Also, because like looking back at interviews, it didn't really seem like he enjoyed them that much.
No, that's definitely true. I think of all the hundreds of interviews that we have and that we listen to, you could count on one hand where he seems to be enjoying it. Other times he just endured it because it was part of the job.
Mhm. Yeah, so he didn't really he was a very private person, right?
Oh, very, very much so. Yes, he was extremely private, which always surprises people because of this stage persona. I think everybody imagines he's going to be very over the top off stage, and he was the exact opposite.
Yeah, because I that was also mentioned in the book that people really had a hard time distinguishing like his onstage persona and who he was like just in his daily life, and that people would actually sometimes be rather disappointed when they actually got to know him.
Well, I can't think of anybody, certainly any famous person, that was as different off stage as on stage. I'm sure it must be true of certain actresses and actors, and probably other pop stars as well. But definitely Freddie was the polar opposite in private than he was in public. I think people that were expecting him to be similar off stage than he is on stage would find the private Freddie, I wouldn't say boring or uninteresting, just very different. They'd probably be intrigued at how shy he was and how private and reserved he was. He wasn't willing to talk about his personal private life. He'll talk about the Queen show, where his latest album was Song, but rarely did he get into the nitty gritty of things unless he was talking to somebody that he really trusted and felt at ease with.
In the introduction, you and Simon noted like how you had to decide on which quotes to include and which ones to disregard. So, on what basis did you do that?
When we laid out everything that we had, it was very clear which subjects should be chapters. There was an awful lot that we had on him talking about romance and relationships and songwriting and working with Queen and working on solo. So it was very clear that anything to do with any of those subjects would make it, if it was interesting. We didn't use things just for the sake of it. They had to impart something. And then other things where we maybe only had 2 or 3 paragraphs of things that didn't relate to anything else. They were funny, but we didn't know how to use them. We couldn't just have a chapter where he's randomly talking about something just for 2 paragraphs. So only very relatively few things didn't make the book. Anything that Freddie said remotely of interest or that gave you an insight, we tried hard to use wherever we could. We did edit it down a bit. We tried to be a bit more concise than he was sometimes, but we didn't brutally edit him because we wanted it to come over like Freddie was. It had to be a little bit like sounding like Freddie as much as possible, and I think we succeeded in that.
What I was also wondering is, were there any times where you and Simon actually disagreed on what to include?
No, not really. Most of it was self-evident. The only thing we would disagree on, but not in a major way, was the sequence of the book. So I might say, look, this paragraph here, he starts talking about songwriting, but then he goes into romance. So I would actually think the romance part here is stronger than the songwriting, so let's put it in the romance. And he would either come back and agree or say, well, actually, I think the emphasis is on songwriting. It'd make me rethink it, and sometimes I'd agree, and sometimes I wouldn't. But we work very well together, and we're very like-minded. So I think 99% of the time we agreed anyway, and then the rest of the time I would go with his strong feeling, or he would go with mine.
What was the hardest part, actually, when it came to creating the book?
Well, the hardest part is when you finish collating all your text and you edit it, and you're looking at 70,000 words and, I don't know, 900 paragraphs, and we cut them all up, physically cut them up. We printed them off and cut them up, all these paragraphs, put them on the floor, and then we started gathering them for chapters. So we would go looking for the romance chapter and pick up all of those paragraphs. Then we'd go for songwriting. And then we noticed that there were so many comments about Bohemian Rhapsody that should be a chapter on its own. So we did that, and then we had to put those paragraphs in order, in sequence. And then you have to go looking for repetition, which is very, very difficult to do, because there was a line that he said, which we included in the chapter where he's talking about Mary Austin, but then we'd also find it later on in songwriting or something somewhere else. So there was an awful lot to be aware of, but the hardest thing was getting it in the correct sequence.
Okay, I see. So it was just like, after collecting everything, it was just a huge puzzle that you had to figure out eventually.
That's true. It was much like a huge puzzle. Anybody that took the job on would do it differently. You could ask 1,000 people to collate all that information and put it in an order, and every one of them would offer it slightly or radically different. So we did what we thought was logical, and actually we tried to do it in the way that we thought Freddie might approach it. We tried to approach it in a way that wasn't predictable and often jolted a bit, because that's how Freddie was in interview. He would jolt you and surprise you.
As you previously said, every single person would have done it differently, and every single different compilation could also bring in new insights in that sense. And I was just wondering, was it hard compiling and putting together the quotes without taking them out of context? Because they also come from various sources, such as in used materials from magazines and articles and things like that.
Yes, I hear you. You've put your finger right on the crux of the matter, as we might say. In that, we were offering Freddie's quotes from his entire career and his life, his adult life. So there were various times where we would gather all the things where he's talking about a certain subject, but his opinion would change over 20 years. As it would if I were to ask you the same question over 20 years, your opinion would change as you got older and wiser, and etc. Mm-hmm. So we were trying to offer the best of Freddie Mercury in conversation, very much aware that sometimes it conflicted, but that's why we explained it at the start. Sometimes there was a tense change from the past tense to the present one, and then he'd go back to the present and back to the past, and then we're in the current time. So sometimes it was a little bit jarring and a little bit at odds, but that was the reason for it. And sometimes the context was a bit mixed. There were various things that made it difficult, because Freddie would often start a sentence and then change complete tack halfway through the sentence, then go off at an unrelated tangent, and then come back again or not. And if you offer that true to Freddie, it doesn't read, it looks like it's been badly edited.
Yeah.
But actually, you could argue that it's been badly delivered by Freddie, but that's just the way he was. He was often all over the place, and we weren't going to try to change that. We wanted Freddie to come across on every page. So that's why it might seem to go off at weird tangents. But I don't know if I'm answering your question, but these were the things that made it very difficult. The way he spoke, the way he changed tack and changed subject, and the past and the present tense. All of those things made it more difficult than it would be if I was writing a book on you and I spoke to you all day long and then quoted you. Everything would be flowing and fluid.
Mm-hmm.
You know, because we're talking to you in the same time frame. If I talk to you over 20 years, 500 times, it would be much more difficult to offer it.
Yeah, because that was what I was wondering about as well. Because looking at interviews that Freddie did, you'd often see him like start a sentence and then just abruptly finish it and then start a whole new topic.
Yeah.
But I did feel that the book did a great job of still making it legible, if that makes sense.
Yes, I appreciate that. I mean, that was so much our priority. You know, it had to be true, and it had to have the integrity of Freddie. And we had a very nice comment. The nicest comment of all, actually, came from Roger Taylor, who said that when his PA was reading the book to him, I think he was en route to a premiere or something, and he was in the back of a car and she was reading the book to him. And he said it was just like having Freddie back in the room again, which is great, but that's only possible because we left some of the things in that were so very Freddie. Him getting bored halfway through a sentence, or actually saying to the interviewer, hurry up, I'm bored, you know, or ask me something interesting, dear. We often left those things in where he's explaining something very well, and then suddenly he loses interest and stops or changes the subject. So we did that deliberately a few times, and some people have interpreted that, I think, as, what are the authors doing here? Why have they done that? Because they don't realise that's what Freddie did.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because it does have that distinct voice that Freddie had. But yeah, I can imagine that people might think, okay, well, that's a weird sentence or like a clunky paragraph. But in the end, it's still Freddie.
Yes, I mean, the thing to keep in mind is if Freddie were around still and writing his own biography or even ghostwriting it with someone, he would want it to be very unusual and different and shocking and surprising, not just in its content, but the way that it was delivered. He wouldn't want it to be like everybody else's book. He would want it to be, I would imagine anyway, a bit jumping and a bit jarring and jolting and all over the place, just because he was a bit like that. So, you know, it was important to try to do what we thought he would like us to do on his behalf.
Yeah, no, definitely. I really enjoyed the way it was put together.
Right, thank you.
So it's been over 13 years since the first edition came out, I believe, and it was noted that there was a whole lot of new material which was found over the years. And my question is, how much was added to this latest edition, and how often does it actually occur that new material sort of just pops up?
Okay, well, that's a great question. What happened was over the last 10 years, is it 10 years? It's a bit more than 10 years, isn't it? So
yeah.
2006, I lose track. Time speeds so quickly. When you're working with or for Queen, the time just speeds past. And I know a third of my life has just flashed before me. But over the last 10 years, I've been aware that we found various interviews on various places, in various places. So, for example, I came across lots of magazines and newspapers from various countries in the world that I wasn't aware of before. I had them transcribed, and I recognised lots of stuff I'd never seen or heard before. We found some interview tapes in the archive on 1/4-inch analogue tape, or on Brian May's personal cassette recordings that he made back in the 70s and 80s. All kinds of things I was aware of that we really should investigate. So we did investigate them, realised there was something like 40,000 words once we transcribed it that wasn't in the original book.
Oh, wow.
So we thought we can't offer 40,000 words just because we have them, because not all of it's fascinating. So we got that down to about 8,000 words. About 80% of it went in order to keep the best stuff, the most interesting. And that's why there is, I think, another 8,000 words in this new edition. The first edition, by the way, I should say, back in 2006, kind of came and went without anybody noticing, because we didn't really have a distribution network in place at that time. So you never saw it in any of the big bookstores or anything, and it wasn't on Amazon then or on the internet. So very few people were aware of it then. So it seems to me anyway, it feels like to me and Simon that this is the first time for this book, because it's really the first time anybody's been properly aware of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because also, like, looking on Goodreads, you really see that the most comments or the most times that the book was added was actually just quite recently.
Yes. There's very, very little you'll find in relation to that book from 2006 period. It's a bit of a touchy subject for me, because back in the day I thought it really deserved to be in all the bookstores and everywhere, but it wasn't. But anyway, now that we've revisited it, we have re-examined every page and tidied it just a little bit and tightened it up quite a bit. There was some duplication in the original which had slipped through, which now, with modern databases and computer search techniques, we were very strict on removing all the repetition. I had some help here with a couple of colleagues that were very kind to me to spend weeks searching for repetition and punctuation problems. So the new version is not only offering much more text and much more insight into Freddie, it's tighter and it's been honed, and we think it's in the best possible shape now.
Yeah, because I think also the internet must have helped a lot, since like social media and YouTube, for instance, because like a couple of interviews or like performances of Queen, I wouldn't have been able to really find actually if it wasn't for YouTube.
Well, that's absolutely true. I mean, even going back just 13 years or 14 years to the first edition, I think 95% of the things you would now find on YouTube for Freddie did not exist then. Just even in that most recent time, there's been an abundance of Freddie interviews, and especially since the Bohemian Rhapsody movie as well. I mean, we weren't relying on the internet back in 2006. We were relying on our own research, our own audio tapes and videotapes and magazines and newspapers and radio programs for all of this stuff. Now you could approach it differently, and you could probably gather it all from what is public domain.
How much material do you actually reckon wasn't used, and do you think it will ever see the light of day?
The answer probably is yes, in terms of some of it, not all of it, would see the light of day sometimes at some point in the future, because anything that we have with Freddie or Queen that's remotely good, and by that I mean outtakes from an album, for example, recordings, or indeed you could apply that to interview outtakes, just because they weren't broadcast at the time on the radio or television, or just because they didn't make the album of the time, doesn't mean they were substandard. You can only get so much material on your album or in your program. But certainly the Queen archive and the Freddie archive is full of unused gems. But that doesn't mean all of them would be used, but certainly some of them. I mean, we put together, one of my first jobs working for Queen was we put together a Freddie Mercury box set in year 2000 called the Solo Collection, and it was 12 discs, and it had many outtakes of Freddie's solo career and so much stuff from the archive that people simply had never heard. And we did a thorough job. So 90% of Freddie's outtakes from the solo sessions anyway is already out there. When it comes to Queen, you could dip in and out of the archive for the next 20 years probably.
I bet.
Yeah, because Freddie and the band were so prolific, so creative, there's an awful lot of stuff. They might have been working in the studio for a whole year, and then they release an album with 9 tracks that spans 40 minutes. But there may be hundreds of hours of recorded material that's never seen the light of day. Not necessarily all finished, but some great ideas and some great concepts that are partially finished or nearly finished, or they just couldn't fit on the album at the time. I mean, we did a Queen News of the World 40th anniversary box back in 2017, and we filled a whole CD just with News of the World outtakes that really amazed people. We could have done probably 2 albums, but we chose the very best, and it just illustrates how much great stuff there is that didn't come anywhere near being released back in the day.
Yeah, because that's something I noticed as well, like with interviews that I always spoke about, like how they didn't get the chance during one album to do one thing, and now they got the chance. And so, yeah, I bet there must be so much still out there that a lot of people haven't heard.
Well, I think you're right, but I would add this. It's very important to add this, just because I think a certain thing in the archive is brilliant and great because it's been made by my favourite band. And first and foremost, I'm a Queen fan. Okay, I work for the band, which is a great privilege, but really I'm a huge fan. So just because I think an outtake of I Want It All is brilliant and should be released, that doesn't mean the band do. And it's down to the band to decide what stuff gets heard and used. When we did the 2011 remaster bonus CDs for Universal, we put all kinds of outtakes and unreleased rarities on those discs. And Brian and Roger were very, very protective of every single note of each track. So they threw out a lot of stuff which we thought was fab and great. You know, but it doesn't matter what we think. It only matters what they think. It's their music, it's their property, their legacy. And so far they haven't done at all bad, have they, with their various policies. So we're governed by them. We can only guide them and say, this is what's in the archive. We think this is pretty good. And then they go through it and say, well, we agree with you there, but not that. That can't go out. Don't want that to go out. And they're still as protective today as they ever were.
Well, those were all of my main questions. I still have some short, quick fire questions, if you're ready.
Yes.
Okay, so what's your favourite Queen song and album?
I don't have one favourite Queen song. I have things that vary. So I have things that spring to mind, like Flick of the Wrist. I love Flick of the Wrist. The Prophet song. I love... You Take My Breath Away. I love Save Me. Too Much Love Will Kill You. I love Tenement Funster. I love various things that John did, especially the heavy stuff like You and I. All those, many things. I've got a great favourite on nearly every album, and on some albums I've got 2 or 3. So I said for many years that the Ferry Fellas Master Stroke was my favourite, so we'll go with that one.
Okay. Those are a lot of songs. Would you reckon that you like the earlier stuff more than the later ones, or the other way around?
Probably in general, if I were to make a compilation of all my favourite things, they'd probably mostly be from about 73 up to 78. Most of my favourite stuff is on the first 5 or 6 albums, but that doesn't mean the other stuff isn't great. I love a lot of stuff on Innuendo and The Miracle and Works and Made in Heaven. Mm-hmm. Favourite album, you said, didn't you? It would probably be Queen 2 or Day at the Races.
Oh, Queen 2 is mine as well.
Ah, right. Great.
So what's your favourite Freddie song?
You Take My Breath Away is wonderful. I love My Fairy King as well. And Fairy Fella's Masterstroke and Somebody to Love. You better stop me.
Yeah. Yes, let's go to the next question. So, out of all of Freddie's iconic outfits, which one do you like the most?
Outfits, blimey, you've stumped me there. Outfits, let me think what I like to see him in. Things like he wore in Hyde Park. On stage, do you mean, or in promo videos?
Either way.
Okay, on stage, I prefer him back in the iconic days, like I would think 75, Hammersmith Odeon, that very brilliant costume that he wore there, and the leotards that he wore at Hyde Park and in the We Are the Champions video, they to me scream out Freddie Mercury being completely different to anybody else of the time, doing his own thing and not giving a damn what people thought.
With his ballet shoes and stuff.
Ballet shoes, that's right, exactly right. He looked amazing, in my opinion. It never struck me for 1 minute that he looked ridiculous or stupid or silly, as some people that I was at school with would often say. You know, you like Freddie Mercury, don't you? But he looks ridiculous. I think, no, he doesn't. He looks fantastic, and he's completely captivating, and he demands your attention when he's on stage, and that's exactly what it's supposed to be.
Exactly. Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, to me, he always looked so fabulous, and I feel like he's like one of the few people who could actually wear those type of stuff and just completely rock it.
Yeah, I mean, he was so groundbreaking and innovative, not just in the studio writing and recording, but on stage, the way he presented himself and, you know, the way he entertained was unbelievable. I know people always allude to that, but he really was. He was phenomenal on stage.
Yes, definitely. I feel so bad I never got the chance to actually see him live. I mean, I was born like way after he passed, unfortunately.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I saw them. I was privileged to see Freddie, and nothing compares with it. And I really mean that. No other band I've ever seen came, or any other performer, and I've seen some great ones, had quite what Freddie had. He actually took my breath away. Sometimes I would struggle to breathe and think I was having either a heart attack or a what they would call today a panic attack.
Oh, wow.
When he came on stage, because you struggle to breathe in those first few seconds because it was so overwhelming.
Oh, that's so amazing.
Yeah, it's hard to explain, but people that saw Freddie, who loved him and loved the way he was, know what I mean, because they went through a similar thing.
When I posted the picture on Instagram, when I was talking about the book, I got a lot of messages from people who had actually seen him live, who were like, yeah, I saw him back in the 70s and I was completely captivated by him. It was so amazing.
Wow, that's great. Also, sorry, just to add to that, I work with people now that worked with Freddie and knew him well. And because he was comfortable with them, of course, he only worked with people he was comfortable with. And they will tell you stories, just little details. And I sit there in wonderment listening to these little details of how funny he was and how creative he was and always surprising people, but just being a lovely person. It's nice to hear all that. Yeah.
The perks of being the archivist. On that topic, what was the coolest thing you ever got to do as the archivist?
Well, the best part of the job by some way is not a big part of the job because I only get to do it every now and then. But one of the first things I did for Queen, I spent, I think, a year and a half listening to all the outtakes and logging them. So going back to all and every session tape and making notes about what was happening, what they were playing, who was playing what, how the lyrics differed, how the song structure differed. It was a completely different version, or it was very similar to the familiar version, or it's the same backing track but with completely different lyrics or vocal delivery. Listening to all that stuff was absolutely amazing and astonishing, and all the things you'd expect it to be. And occasionally you would hear something that really floored you or blew you away. Like I remember hearing Let Me In Your Heart Again from the work sessions, because I'd never heard it. At that time, nobody had heard it publicly. And there was this phenomenally brilliant song, more or less finished, with Freddie singing it. And you just you can't believe what you're hearing.
Oh, wow. That's amazing.
Yeah, that's the best part of the job. And also, in more recent years, listening through to a load of cassettes that I found in Brian's house in an old chest of drawers that he asked me to investigate. And we found about 80 cassettes. A lot of those were session outtakes, but a lot of them were live recordings from Queen in the US in the 76, 77, 1980. And some of that stuff was just mind-blowingly good. And Brian has the only known copy that survives on many of those things. So that's quite a precious resource. So we've been digitally copying them and making sure that they're preserved. And some of those Queen live 1970s were just amazing.
Yeah, I actually tend to prefer listening to their live performances, like just listening to them live. It's very hard for me to believe like what they're playing is actually live because it's so good.
Well, that's true, isn't it? And it was just the four of them. It sounds like you might be listening to a 7 or 8 piece.
Exactly.
You're listening to 4 very brilliant musicians who really know their craft inside and out, and are just great together. The chemistry and the rapport with the 4 of them on stage. And like you say, I agree with you. When I hear some of those concerts, is that really just the 4 of them?
Exactly.
That's why they're my favourite band. It didn't happen by accident. It's because they're so brilliant on stage and in the studio.
The last question is, imagine yourself being part of a glam rock group in the early 70s. What instrument would you play?
Good grief, what a dreadful prospect. What instruments? I would play an instrument that meant I wouldn't have to be seen on stage. So I would play something where I could remain in the dark or behind the curtain at the back.
Like, I don't know, a xylophone or something.
Oh, even the triangle, where I'd only have to play one note for the entire concert, that would suit me. And I wouldn't, under any circumstance, wear a leotard or any such thing. I wouldn't want to offer that image to the world.
I reckon a lot of people wouldn't go for leotards.
No, I think you're right. No, I could never see myself doing remotely what the Queen guys did or anyone else. I would love to have been around in another context, certainly would love to have been there looking after them in the dressing room or just taking care of day-to-day duties, some kind of personal assistant to the 4 of them. That would have been great, looking after them and making sure they've got what they need. Or even, as Brian has said to me before, would have been great to have had you around since day one, gathering all the gems, all the posters and tickets and tour program and all the things that there must have been that didn't get retained.
Mainly Brian kept a lot of things.
Yes, Brian kept an awful lot, but nobody kept everything. I'd like to go back in the time machine with a great big flight case for every tour and fill it from the first night right through to the last. But we have got a staggering amount of stuff still, both from Brian and Roger. Mainly Brian, yes, it's true.
Well, those were all of the questions I had. Thank you so much, Greg, for coming on. It was such a pleasure talking to you.
And to you as well, Seji. Thanks for your time and thank you for your interest in the book.
Thank you. Well, that is the end of this episode of A Book Chat with Greg Brooks. Thanks everyone for tuning in, and I will see you in the next video.